This presentation will be delivered in two parts, and this is a summary of the early automobile industry from the early days before the turn of the century up well into the 1920s. It'll be centered around Henry Ford because he's by far the single most important figure in the development of the automobile industry, at least for mass production. We take for granted the internal combustion engine, a gasoline engine, as a power source for a car until very recently, when there's been a lot of talk about electric cars and hybrids. But early on, there were really three options, and one of them was steam, one was electric, one was gasoline. And gasoline did not really take the leading role in this. The others seemed to be more viable. Electric cars. The problem that has been addressed only very recently, only a century later, was that the batteries were very, very heavy and their capacity was limited. They needed recharging every few miles, like 25 to 40 miles. So this was an enormous disadvantage. This is a 1909 Baker Electric that you see here. Steamers, as this 1906 Stanley steamer exemplifies, were heavy and they were slow. They usually couldn't go more than about 20 miles an hour. This is really a steam engine in the same way that a steamboat or a locomotive would run on steam. They were inefficient. They needed water and coal to run. On cold mornings, they would take up to 45 minutes to start. You needed to burn the coal to heat the water to get enough steam before the car would run. And the boilers and burners had to be cleaned out thoroughly every week, and that was not a very pleasant job. So there were obvious major disadvantages with steamers. Nevertheless, there was a survey done of the total number of cars in New York, Chicago, and Boston in the year 1900. In these three major cities, there were only 2,370 cars. That's a very small number. But of those, about half were steamers. And then there were 800 electrics and only 400 gasoline-powered cars. So, gasoline engines were running a distant third. Now, of course, Henry Ford would change that. Why was Michigan the center of the automobile industry? Well, first of all, you had investment capital from lumber. There were lumber barons in Michigan who had made a lot of money by cutting down half the lower peninsula for the lumber needs of the nation. And they were looking for a place to invest their money. Money from the east tended to be tied up in steel and oil, so they were not very focused on investing in the automobile industry. The Upper Peninsula was nearby as a source of iron. Of course, that was a major need as a raw material. There were also a couple of good decisions made by two pioneers of the industry, Ransom Olds and Henry Ford. Olds as in Oldsmobile. The decisions were, first of all, to use the gasoline engine, which was not typical at the time, and secondly, to build smaller, cheaper cars. A lot of the early automakers made expensive handmade cars, and they wanted to make a large profit margin on each car, but this limited their sales to only a small segment of wealthier people. To really allow the industry to come to the fore, you had to sell to more people than that. And finally, Detroit's pre-existing industries were well suited to be adapted to the production of automobiles. Before there were autos, there was shipbuilding in Detroit, especially marine engines. There were railroad cars made here, bicycles, steam engines. Machine shops were plentiful here. All of these industries would contribute to the automobile. They were necessary if you were going to begin a new industry in building cars. They all had skilled labor and manufacturing capacity. So uh, Detroit was well suited to automobiles even before they were made here. Um, in the old system of car production, there were teams of 10 to 20 workers who worked for hours building one car at a time. The parts were brought to the car and they were fitted to it. They weren't necessarily interchangeable. There was a lot of pounding and filing and very skilled work, very tedious work to build a car. A lot of handwork, skilled work, uh, and this is a system that came from carriage making. And of course, the early automobiles were called horseless carriages. Now, before the 1930s, Detroit was not highly unionized. It later developed a reputation for being a city in which unions were very strong, but that only came in the 1930s. Um, there was a group called the Employers Association of Detroit, and they fought unions tooth and nail. Uh, if a worker were seen to be engaged in union organizing, he would typically be blacklisted, put on a common list maintained by the Employers Association of Detroit, and that would prevent him from getting a job anywhere in the city. Um, as work became de-skilled and more of it could be done by unskilled workers, that made union organizing even more difficult. Workers, of course, and this is true everywhere, could be fired at will, no job security, no guarantees. Uh, Henry Ford is the key person in the early auto industry. In 1896, he built a quadricycle. Obviously, the name comes from a bicycle. It's a bicycle with four wheels and a small uh, engine in the rear. Uh, the car that really put him on the map, of course, was the Model T. First, he had a Model A, Model B, Model C, and then when he got to the Model T, he had one that would sell. Later on, there was a second Model A that, of course, replaced the Model T. Uh, this is Highland Park, Michigan, about 10 minutes from our school. This plant is largely still here. Um, and in 1915, this was the scene outside. Highland Park was a separate city, which was completely dominated by Ford. They could control the city government. They could establish regulations that were favorable to the company. Um, Ford's system could be called rationalized production to make it as smooth and efficient and cost-effective as possible. Um, One of the features of this was an extreme division of labor. One worker would do one job and only one job over and over and over again. Uh, and of course, this made possible de-skilling, where if you only had to teach a worker one job, uh, that worker would not have to be highly trained. Uh, and that made it possible for Ford to cut labor costs and become more efficient. Um, I think, believe I already looked at Frederick W. Taylor. He was what today we would call an industrial psychologist. He did time and motion studies, and he looked at every movement made in the entire process of assembling an automobile and recommended ways that it could be sped up, so that it could be done more efficiently with fewer movements. Uh, a key milestone was the moving assembly line. It began, now it had existed for things like sewing machines earlier, much earlier, but it was first applied to the automobile in Highland Park, right on Woodward Avenue, in 1913. Henry Ford set up, thousands of machines that each of which was precisely designed to do one job. And this is an early photo of a Model T assembly line. One component of the car will illustrate Ford's approach here, and that was the construction of what he called the Magneto assembly. It served the purposes of a generator or alternator on modern cars, or a generator and or slash alternator and distributor for the Model T. It had 29 parts. Now, the first approach to this was that one worker assembled the entire Magneto assembly from 29 different bins. It would have to walk over and reach for each of the parts and put them together. The labor time was 20 minutes per Magneto. In other words, one worker working for 20 minutes could produce one of these units. In the second stage, Ford assigned 29 workers to the process, one for each part. And he had a sliding bench that when the worker was finished with installing his piece to the assembly, he would slide the bench along to the next worker who would then install his piece. So now this, by doing this, Ford was able to cut the assembly time from 20 minutes, worker minutes per assembly, to 13. Of course, you have more workers, but they're producing more. So if you do the math and you figure out how much worker time is involved in producing one of these, it goes from 20 minutes to 13. Now, in the third stage of this, there was a powered assembly line, a moving conveyor, and the workers could no longer control the speed. So they would refer to this as a speed up. And then Ford experimented with different workers until he found enough who could keep up with this very fast pace. And at that point, he had reduced the assembly time to 5 worker minutes per Magneto assembly. And we started with 20, remember. So he has achieved a 75% savings in labor. This is the Magneto flywheel assembly. You can see, there's a group of 29 workers close together who are, taking parts from bins right below the conveyor belts and assembling these. Now, by 1914, the Highland Park plant had 13,000 workers and 15,000 machines. They were developed to do specific jobs that had never been done before. And they were arranged in the order of their use on the car. So everything was highly organized and as efficient as possible. And in some of these processes, the amount of labor needed was reduced by 90 or even 95%. There is a phrase or a word called Fordism. It stands for mass production and lowering the price of the product as much as possible, and therefore allowing sales of enormous numbers. It also included increasing the pay of the workers. Now, this was not out of generosity. It was out of a recognition that he had to have people who would stay, who wouldn't need, so he wouldn't have a problem with turnover, which was a huge issue for him. This was all done in the interest of making production as efficient as possible and eliminating as many interruptions as he could in the process. He was geared for mass production. He hated new models. He hated variations because they added so much to the cost of the car. They added the cost of designing it and retooling the machines to produce it. They interrupted production while the retooling was going on. These were all things that added to his costs and required that he charge more for a car. So These were very much opposed to his philosophy, his philosophy of Fordism. Um, he wanted to produce practical, plain, durable cars for farmers in the middle class. He was looking back to his own agricultural roots when he thought this way. He wasn't going for glamour, uh, and he wanted to lower prices as much as possible. He loved to prove people wrong by both lowering prices and raising wages at the same time. Famous quotation from Ford: "You can have any color you want as long as it's black." Um, Offering the car in different colors would have slowed the process down and raised his costs, and he hated that. Um, he had a yearning for rural America. You see this in Greenfield Village. He founded Greenfield Village because it took him back to an earlier, simpler, more agricultural America. Um, but he wanted to make farmers' lives easier with his Model T. He believed in traditional American values. His favorite recreation was the square dance, for example. Um, but there's a great irony here that although he was a cultural traditionalist, he did more than anyone else to end this traditional America by putting the nation on wheels. Now let's take a look at the price of a Model T. Remember, it's Ford's goal to reduce it. In 1909, this was before the assembly line, uh, a Model T cost $925. This was, far more than the annual wages of most workers. He sold 12,000 of these, and he had a 10% of the American automobile market. 1914, after he had begun the assembly line, he cut it to $490 and sold almost $250,000, and that was now 45% market share. And then you look at these numbers, and by 1926, he could sell a Model T for $260, and he sold 1.3 million. But you see here that his peak comes in the early 20s. He got to 47% market share. And then it starts to decline under the influence of General Motors, who offered more models, more fancier styling, more colors, things like that. Now, this is a key statistic. Ford wanted his workers to be able to buy his products. In 1909, it would have taken one of his workers almost 2 years, 22 months, to earn enough money to buy a Model T. And this is not allowing for any of their other expenses, food, housing, anything else. So this really meant that they were priced out of the automobile market. And then look what happens here. By 1923, a worker could buy a brand new car with less than 3 months' salary, the salary that he made working at Ford. So he took the automobile and made it part of the middle class. The chassis was very simple, as you can see here. He had a few variations over time, not very many. This is a 1926 Model T runabout. And these were some of the workers who worked at the Highland Park plant. This will be continued in part 2.